I'd like to start off by saying that I'm a skeptic, at least for the most part. I do think that cryptids and ghosts and other phenomena exist, but I also believe that the best way to undeniably prove they do truly exist is to eliminate any possible explanations for what mundane, everyday occurrences could be happening instead. Maybe that strange creature following behind you was simply a sick, mange-ridden bear or coyote. Maybe the noises coming from your basement are from the house's foundation settling, or from mice living in the vents. But maybe they aren't. Maybe that strange creature is a werewolf or chupacabra or a relative of Bigfoot. Maybe a spirit or demon is making those noises in your basement after all. The only way to find out for sure is by thoroughly investigating, researching, and collecting evidence. I'm an animal scientist and a biologist by trade, and I've had the importance of data collection drilled into me for years. I believe it applies to unexplained phenomena just as much as it does to physical, structured, scientific research. I have had two experiences in my life that I absolutely cannot explain by any means whatsoever. I've thought about them a lot throughout the years and constantly revisit them, researching possibilities for what could have happened, and I've never come up with any satisfactory explanations. Let's start from the beginning. I was born and grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. I lived about 15 or 20 minutes from the Missouri border, so a good chunk of my childhood was spent split between the two states. When I was a kid, I was involved in Girl Scouts, as were several friends of mine. I was and still am a lover of everything wilderness and camping related, so of course I went on every single camping trip offered by the Scouts. Fourth grade came around and my troop was making plans for an awesome camping trip in western Missouri, about an hour from where we lived. The camp, which I'll call Camp T, was situated in the middle of a forest and offered plenty of trails to walk on and explore. There was a huge wooden cabin to sleep in too. The weekend we had reserved to go to Camp T finally arrived, and I could hardly sit still during the car ride. When we arrived at the camp, everyone rushed into the cabin to find the best places to put their sleeping bags and luggage, so we could go outside and play. There were maybe 15 or so girls and 5 or 6 parents, including my own mom, on this trip. We argued and bickered as kids do, about who got to sleep in what room and who got to sleep next to whom. So I started unpacking and making plans for the evening. We were going to play hide and seek and tag, have a bonfire, make trail mix with extra M&Ms and chocolate chips, stay up late talking about books, movies, boys, school, ghost stories, and whatever else 10-year-old girls like to talk about. At one point while we were playing tag, I needed to run to the cabin for a bathroom break and to grab my bottle of water from my bag. My best friend at the time, Kyra, came with me. We went into the cabin and did our business, and as we were getting ready to head back out, the door to the room we were in latched shut on its own. We knew for a fact we had been the only ones inside, and it's unlikely that it could have been caused by a draft. We were in an interior room and the cabin had been recently renovated. It was not at all drafty. Of course, Kyra and I joked about it being a ghost and the cabin being haunted, and blah blah blah, before running back outside. But I wonder now if there was more truth to that joke than I had anticipated. Everything went by pretty normally for the rest of the evening. We made hot dogs and s'mores for dinner, had some trail mix as a late-night snack, and got ready for bed. Kyra and I were sleeping next to each other, and were excited to tell spooky stories and obsess about Harry Potter and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon. We eventually decided it was time for bed. Kyra fell asleep quickly, and I was getting pretty tired myself. However, I had an intense feeling of fear and unease in the pit of my stomach. I chalked it up to me being scared from thinking about ghosts and the cabin being haunted. I finally fell asleep, and I had been resting peacefully for what seemed like a few hours, when suddenly I woke up in an intense pain, crying, barely holding back from a scream. My entire body felt as if it was burning. My head was spinning, my vision was blurred, and I had spiked a fever. I stumbled out of my room and found my mom. She and the other parents woke up, turning on the lights to see what was happening. It turns out that what was ailing me was a very severe and horrible case of hives. My entire body, from my feet up to my face, was covered in angry red, swollen and itchy splotches, and there was no relief to be found from scratching at them. I've since had multiple fractures and tonsillitis so bad that I had to have steroids injected just to reduce swelling, enough for me to swallow water, and even those occurrences were less painful than these hives. My mom, a former nurse, grabbed me, rushed me to the bathroom, placed me under a cold shower to help soothe the burning and itching. I stayed in that shower for at least half an hour, and my God, it was heavenly. While I was in there, my mom found some Benadryl to give me, and some ointment to rub on the worst of my hives. I took the Benadryl and let my mom apply the ointment, and then I passed out from exhaustion as soon as I put my PJs back on and made it into my sleeping bag. By the next morning, my hives had faded to gentle pink welts, and the pain and itching had greatly subsided. By the time I got home later that day, they had all but vanished. My mom and I tried to think of what could have caused the hives. I don't have any food allergies, though I do have very, very mild nasal allergies from pollen in the spring. But this was fall. It couldn't have been poison ivy. It's not like I was rolling around in random plants in the forest, or even playing anywhere other than the grass in front of the cabin. I don't have any skin allergies to any plants or fungi that could have existed at Camp T. I had lived in that area my entire life, and I had never had any reactions like that before, or since, for that matter. Something else to note is that there were nearly 20 other people on that trip. Why had I been the only one affected? My mom, who has been interested in spirits, positive and negative energies, and psychic readings for several years now, thinks I'm sensitive to spirits and energies. I, being the argumentative skeptic that I am, attributed those feelings to me having anxiety and being on the autism spectrum. But honestly, I can't blame her for becoming involved in what may be considered by some to be heretical beliefs. She had been raised in an abusive household that used a falsified version of Christianity to justify physically and emotionally tormenting her and her siblings. If anything, I'm super proud of her for learning to love herself and finding her own beliefs and morals. Maybe the reason I was the only one who got sick on the trip really was because of a sensitivity to the supernatural. I can't say that I really believe that this is the case, but my mom seems to believe so, and it makes about as much sense as any other explanation. After that unfortunate camping trip, I spent a couple of sleepovers at Kyra's house, brainstorming what might have caused my reaction and what might be living or existing at Camp T, but we never came to any conclusions. It's been about 14 years since then, and that remains the only time I've ever had hives, despite going to the exact campground years later and living and working in very similar environments in the same part of the country. It was truly bizarre. Maybe there was more to that feeling of unease than I had originally thought. Fast forward 4 years to middle school. I'm in 8th grade, and my Girl Scout troop had shrunk to only me and 3 other girls. Kyra and I were still best friends, but she had quit Scouts to focus on other interests. The 3 other girls were all lovely and kind though, and I got along great with them. It was fall again, and we were looking into doing a seasonal camping trip. Eventually, we settled on going back to Camp T, planning on doing some hiking, plant and wildlife identification, and working on completing our silver awards. We joked about how I'd gotten sick from the ghosts the last time we were at Camp T, but overall, we were excited for the trip. The weekend of the trip arrived, and we made the drive out to the campsite with one of our troop leaders acting as chauffeur. Everything looked exactly the same as I'd remembered. Beautiful sylvan surroundings, vibrant red and orange leaves on the trees, fresh air, expansive natural areas to roam in and explore. Ghosts, hives, and uneasy feelings were in the very back of my mind, and were the least of my worries. For a couple of hours, at least. The other girls and I made some plans for the afternoon and evening. Two of them, Eva and Courtney, and I wanted to walk the trails in the area and look for animal tracks and cool plants to get some exercise in. The third girl, Jamie, wasn't feeling up to hiking and stayed behind with our chauffeur at the cabin to prepare dinner and discuss what to make for breakfast the next day. Eva, Courtney, and I decided to walk the main trail, which amounted to about 2 miles round trip. It circled out from our cabin, across a hillside, past the camp owner's house, and through a densely forested part of the area. We were all huge nature geeks and thought we could handle anything the forest threw at us. Eva and I both wanted to be exotic animal vets at the time, and Courtney regularly went hunting with her father. We were all fairly experienced in camping and hiking. We headed off with a pep in our step and smiles on our faces, ready to pretend to be explorers and make some cool discoveries. If only we had known exactly what we would discover on that hike. We'd made it to about the halfway point of the trail, when it suddenly got dead silent in the woods. If you know anything about camping, hiking, or wilderness survival, you know that this is never a good sign. We saw then a strange, indistinguishable lump on the path several yards in front of us. Curious, we got closer to check it out. I wish now that we would have stopped back then, turned back as soon as it grew silent. But we were curious 13 and 14-year-olds. We thought we were invincible. We crept closer to the strange lump and began to see what it was. A sense of dread crept over me as I realized what exactly we had stumbled across. On the trail in front of us was a completely eviscerated deer carcass. The top of the head was lying in the middle of the path. The ears and snout were intact, but the eyes were gone. The bottom jaw and part of the neck had been ripped off, exposing the tongue, trachea, and esophagus. The spinal cord was hanging out of the back of the head, snapped clean in half, though the other half was nowhere to be seen. Off to the side of the path were some of the poor deer's organs. Intestines strung out for several feet, liver and stomach nearby. But that was it. No torso, no lungs or heart or legs or random bones. And perhaps most disturbingly, absolutely no blood. No footprints from what may have killed or eaten the deer. I've done countless animal dissections since then, and I've seen enough slaughterhouse corpses and procedures to make even the most staunch meat lover go vegetarian. But this, it remains one of the most graphic and disturbing things I've ever seen, and thinking of it still makes me nauseous to this day.
What the hell?
Courtney whispered under her breath as we approached the deer. Eva was completely speechless, wide-eyed and frozen in fear.
What the heck did this?
I asked Courtney, assuming she knew the most about local predators from her hunting background.
I don't know. It couldn't have been coyotes. They mostly hunt small animals, and they would never leave a deer out here in the open near humans like this. They're scavengers. They'd eat all of it.
I pulled out my laughably small pocket knife.
Do you think it could have been a mountain lion? I know they've been spotted a couple of times in Kansas and Missouri. I doubt it. There haven't been many sightings near this area, and an animal that big would have surely been spotted by one of the camp workers, and they would have closed the camp down.
Courtney grabbed her pocket knife as well, and Eva, who didn't have her knife with her, put a hand on her metal water canteen so she could have at least something to attack with, other than her hands, if it came down to it. We were all silent for a moment. A feeling of dread built up in my stomach, and I was instantly transported back to 4 years ago, when I had that exact same feeling at this exact same camp. There aren't any large predators in western Missouri. We have coyotes, foxes, and bobcats, but nothing that would, or could, do something like this to a large, fully grown deer. No bears, no wolves. Very rarely mountain lions, and as Courtney said, we would have been notified if there were a mountain lion in the area. They tend to be pretty noticeable around here, and are extensively monitored by wildlife officials. We all glanced at each other and came to a silent agreement to get the heck out of there. We took off running at full speed down the trail. When we got back to camp, we burst through the cabin doors panting and speaking incoherently, startling Jamie and our chauffeur, who looked at us like we were crazy. Eva and I were holding back tears. We were both huge softies and had never seen a horror movie before, much less a poor, torn-up dead animal. Courtney was wide-eyed and speechless and seemed to be on the verge of a panic attack. We explained what we saw to Jamie and our chauffeur, and they both became noticeably uncomfortable. We were so freaked out that we ended up staying inside, playing cards, working on written assignments for badge requirements, and talking about random nonsense to distract ourselves the rest of the evening. We all slept restlessly when we finally went to bed that night. I couldn't fall asleep for what seemed like hours because I was paranoid that someone or something was looking at us through the cabin windows. We packed up and left early the next morning. I spoke to the other girls on the car ride on the way home, and they had all felt a sense of being watched the night before too. Needless to say, that was the last time any of us ever went to Camp T. On the bright side, at least I didn't get hives this time. Unfortunately, our camp troop kind of fell apart after that. We just didn't have the motivation to continue anything camping related, or even General Scout related. We all got our silver awards at the end of 8th grade year, and then left Girl Scouts at the beginning of high school. I'm just thankful that none of us were harmed or horribly mentally scarred from the experience, which could have potentially turned out dangerous, or even deadly. I'm 24 now and still keep in touch with Eva, Courtney, Jamie, and Kyra, and I'm happy to report that we're all doing great and haven't had any more run-ins with strange creatures, eviscerated animals, or ghosts. Jamie and Eva are both married and have become a teacher and a physical therapist respectively. Kyra is an amazing artist and earns a living from her art commissions. Courtney is an extremely talented professional horse trainer, and I have since moved to Oregon, continuing my education to earn a PhD in wildlife biology so I can continue learning about and helping the wild animals and plants I love so much. And if you're curious, I'm studying the relationship between native amphibian health and agricultural practices in the Pacific Northwest for my thesis. Anyway, who knows? Maybe I'll encounter another strange, unexplainable occurrence in the woods. Maybe I'll meet Bigfoot. Or maybe I'll find some answers to what exactly happened at Camp T. But all in all, these two experiences are why I can't consider myself to be 100% a skeptic. I have absolutely no explanation for either of them. I've researched plants, animals, fungi, local legends, even mental conditions that could cause hives or such intense fear and paranoia, and I've never found any answers that make sense. At best, it's a fun ghost story to tell friends and acquaintances, and at worst, there is some unknown horrifying creature or spirit living in the forests of western Missouri, tearing apart animals and terrorizing those who venture too far into the woods. When I was 11, my parents bought their first home. It was our first two-story home, and it even had a pool in a large backyard. My dad was probably the most excited about it, because he could get us our first dog now, as all the other homes we had rented didn't allow them. We got ourselves a yellow lab named Boomer. A year later, we got a second dog, a Schnauzer mix named Misty. They were primarily outdoor dogs, and we'd bring them in around dinner time or when the weather was bad. In California, the weather is almost never bad, and we were outside with them a large portion of the time. The backyard, as mentioned before, was very large. We lived in the center of a small cul-de-sac, so our property was almost wedge-shaped, with a small front yard and a wide backyard. There was a large deck that spanned from one side of the house to the other. Where the deck ended, on the side of the house with my parents' room, there was an awning that covered that section of the deck, as well as a wooden fence that separated the main part of the yard from the side yard. Under the awning, there was a metal screen door in the fence that allowed us to get to the side yard. These details, the deck and the door, are where things began. I no longer remember how soon after we moved in when it happened. Within a year or two, I think. Activities continued until I was maybe 27 or 28, after I'd moved out. My mother heard things first. While she was getting ready for work one day, she heard the metal door outside open and close. Then she began to hear heavy footsteps on the deck outside of her bedroom. It was like there was a large man wearing boots and moving around out there. She told me later that she was scared someone was going to break in. But when she looked outside, there was no one there. The dogs had never even made a peep either, despite being out there with the noise. From then, she would continue to hear footsteps around the house every now and again. One of those first summers there, my two younger siblings and I were allowed to stay home alone for the first time. This was liberating, until we were hanging out in the dining room and began to hear someone walking around upstairs, specifically in my room. I laugh thinking about it now, but I remember the three of us arming ourselves with kitchen knives and slowly stalking our way up the stairs. I couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, my youngest sibling no older than 9 or 10. The sounds we heard had stopped midway up, and we never found anyone upstairs. For a few years we got acclimated to unusual sounds and occurrences. Heavy footsteps, mostly downstairs, but at night was strictly relegated to my bedroom, along with the sound of papers shifting around, occasional touching on the shoulder or low back, as though someone were squeezing by, and on the rarest occasion, a rosy perfume that neither my mom nor my sister wore would fill the room. Once, the sliding closet door in my parents' room slammed closed as I was using the mirror on it. And when my older cousin, who lived with us for several years, moved out, my sister took her room across from my parents' room. She had to keep the door locked when she slept, because someone always jiggled the handle all night if she left it unlocked. One night my sister woke up to the silhouette of a man feeling her forehead. She said that the man had spoken, said something like, "No, that's not good," before turning and leaving. She wound up very sick with swine flu during the outbreak several years ago. My mom told us that the previous owner was a California highway officer who succumbed to cancer in her bedroom. My bedroom had been his office, and my sister's room was his daughter's room. From then, we were amused by everything that happened around the house. It seemed to be the officer, just going about his routine on occasion. Of course, it didn't stay that way. The atmosphere in the house began to get heavy, or oppressive. My youngest sibling's room was beside the top of the stairs, and I'd have to pass by in order to get to my room. I'd always feel like something was lurking in the corner of their bedroom, watching me. Going downstairs was always terrifying too, as I always feared that I was going to be pushed from behind. I always made sure to close their door when they weren't in there. My sibling turned reclusive and drank a lot. My parents are good-intentioned people and generous, but they were reluctant to accept that all of their children were LGBT. My sibling was most affected by it. The more they drank, the more they hid away, the worse the air became. In 2015, my most terrifying experience took place. I can't remember where my parents were, nor can I remember where my sibling was, but my sister was at work and had taken Misty with her. I was home alone, with only my cats and my new dog, Rue. Boomer had passed away 4 years prior. The only lights on in the house at the time were in the living room, where Rue and I were hanging out. There was the sound of someone large and lumbering slowly making its way down the stairs in the dining room behind me. I froze, my heart rate rising as I listened. Rue was sleeping and hadn't budged. The stairs continued to creak and groan, and then whatever it was stepped onto the ground floor. Now, the houses where we lived in California are elevated, not built directly into the ground. So I could tell exactly where whatever it was in the house, based on what part of the floor was creaking in the other room. It moved slowly around the dining room, its footsteps heavier than the ones we'd heard in previous years. It was taking its time, and my blood was running colder and colder. The couch I was on was against the wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. The dark doorway was just 10 feet to my left. It stopped in that doorway. It never crossed into the living room. But I was afraid to look at it, afraid of what I might see. I could feel that it was still there. I could feel it staring at me. "Rue," I whispered harshly. Rue was stirred awake in the middle of the living room floor. I never even had to point it out to her. She immediately locked eyes with something in the doorway and growled. She is a sweet dog, a border collie, but she bared her teeth and growled at this presence. I braved a glance then, and there was nothing there. No shadow out of place, nothing. But Rue didn't let up. Not until my sister came home from work a couple of minutes later. The oppressive air lifted and Rue stopped. Misty didn't even bat an eye as she plodded in to greet me, so I figured whatever had been there was now gone. Nothing as significant occurred until about a year later. My sister had begun a webcomic that was well received. She would spend hours daily drawing it. It would sometimes be in her room where her desk was. One night she was drawing a panel for it, looking up satanic symbols for reference, and I was on the floor sitting against her bed. There was something in her room all of a sudden. I could see it this time. It was a 3-dimensional shadow, and the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. Her lamp beside me was on, and the shadow wasn't terribly dark. It would have been easily missed if it had stayed still, but it didn't. I watched out of horrified curiosity and bewilderment as the figure walked in a counterclockwise circle throughout the room, stopping behind my sister, looming over her as if watching her computer screen, before repeating the process. It would walk behind me, through the bed, and through the lamp beside me, and again stop behind my sister. I tried waving my hand in front of the lamp in different areas, trying to debunk what I was seeing, but I couldn't. Finally, I told her I was going to hang out somewhere else because there was something in the room that I didn't want to see anymore. She told me the next day that later that night, she woke up to use the bathroom and had gone to her closet next to her desk for a pair of shorts. When she bent down, something inches from her face growled at her. She bailed on the shorts and just prayed that my parents wouldn't come out of their bedroom across the hall while she hurried to the bathroom. She then took the old painting of Jesus that had survived a house fire that my mom lived through as a child and placed it in the closet. She didn't have any other significant experiences in that bedroom, not even when we drunkenly made a Ouija board and tried to contact the original spirit in the house, the good one. There was barely any response, though I remember it saying that, yes, it was there. My sister demanded that it prove itself real and even insulted it, but there was no reply. So we said goodbye and decided to go to bed. But when we went to the kitchen to deposit our drinking glasses, the sink was running full bore. We may have gotten off easy then, all things considered. When I got married, my sister and her friend became our roommates that year. They experienced something in that apartment briefly. My sister had a significant health issue that required her to move back into our childhood home after the lease was up. She had moved into my old bedroom then, and there was one last experience there that she told me about. As usual, my sister keeps her bedroom door locked when she sleeps. Well, she woke up one night to the most pungent smell, like rot and ammonia. The ceiling was vaulted, and so the ceiling fan had to hang down a couple of feet. The fan, despite not being on, was swinging almost violently. I had never had activity like that in my bedroom before, and I told her that. She then fetched that Jesus painting again, and once more the activity would stop. My family has since moved from that house. Their new house doesn't have the same oppressive aura, and I've never felt that same aura since. I can stand in a dark room unafraid, unlike how it would be in my childhood home. The feeling of something watching you, the overwhelming feeling of malice in the air. It's not even worth the novelty. I never want to experience anything like that again. A bit of backstory first. Oregon is home to thousands of long-abandoned logging roads. Nearly 50% of the state is covered in forest, and roughly 80% is considered timberland by the Bureau of Land Management. I moved here when I was 16. My mother and stepfather divorced, so I decided to move into southern Oregon to live with my biological father. I grew up all over central and southern California, so the lush, dense landscape of southern Oregon was a new experience for me. It is unbelievably beautiful here. We lived in a small 2-bedroom home in the middle of a 65-acre plot of land. The property bordered the Siskiyou National Forest. You had to drive a good 10 minutes on a narrow dirt road through dense forest to find our driveway. The owners were a lovely elderly couple who lived in the area all their lives. They lived in a large home at the beginning of the property. The elderly gentleman told us we were free to hunt and explore on his land, as much as we desired. He simply requested that we not go on the blocked logging road that led up to the large mountain to our west. We happily agreed, seeing no need to ever do such a thing. This is my experience. I had been living with my dad for about 2 months at this point. I remember being out of school for the weekend, and I loved the weekends. I would explore the dense forest with my dad's 9-month-old German Shepherd, Buck. I'd even camped overnight a couple of times with Buck. I decided I wanted to camp again that night, so I loaded up my pack with everything I'd need for the overnight trip. I asked my dad, who was nervous about me camping alone, and he reluctantly agreed, only requesting that I take the hunting rifle with me. Black bears and wolves are uncommon here, but I saw his reasoning and agreed. I said my goodbyes and headed out with Buck around 6 p.m. that night. I was still new to the area, so I never ventured too far, only camping in places I had previously scouted. I remembered a nice little clearing to the west, so I headed off in that direction. I arrived about 30 minutes later. The clearing was crescent-shaped. The middle of the clearing was roughly 30 feet wide, more than enough room for my one-man tent and a small fire pit. I set my pack down and began gathering large rocks and fallen brush for the fire pit. I had my tent set up and a small fire blazing about 30 minutes later. It was dark at this point. Buck and I were sitting against a fallen log, roasting hot dogs on a large 3-pronged fork. Suddenly, I noticed Buck's ears perk up. He's up on all 4 legs and staring straight into the dark woods behind us. Buck was still a pup. He hadn't quite learned patience or the dangers of the woods yet. So when I heard rustling in the brush, and I saw Buck dash off after the sounds, I wasn't surprised. I stood up and called for him. He wasn't obeying my commands. I started to get worried. I knew I'd have to venture away from camp to find him. I threw my boots on, grabbed my flashlight, and strapped my rifle over my shoulder. I headed off in the direction Buck had gone. I was calling his name, followed by whistling. I then stopped to listen for any sounds for a moment, noises that might indicate his location. I heard nothing but the crickets and frogs, so I pushed on. I knew I had to find him. My dad would be devastated if something happened to his pup. I was about 50 yards from camp then, when I noticed deep tire marks in the ground. They made a small trail through the trees. I remember seeing this before. The trail started at the beginning of the property and led up to the abandoned logging road the old man told us about. I decided to follow this small truck trail, hoping Buck had gone that way. I walked for about 15 minutes when the dense woods started to thin out. The moonlight was shining brightly, and I could easily see without my flashlight. There was a small gate blocking a one-truck-length dirt road. The road ascended the side of a fairly tall mountain. I stood at the gate and called, "Buck, here, boy." I waited for about 10 seconds when I heard from the top of the road, "Buck, here, boy." My blood ran cold. It was like a distorted version of my voice. The tone was almost mocking me. I slowly began to back away from the gate when I saw something at the top of the road. It was on all fours, and it slowly crawled out from the tree line bordering the road. It was incredibly tall, maybe 7 feet, its limbs slender and long. It stood with a hunched back and turned its small head towards me. Its eyes were large and yellow. I was frozen in place, my hands sweating and my body trembling. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound behind me. I turned to see my dad running towards me with Buck close behind. I looked back at the road to see a single large male deer standing where the creature had been. And it was just staring at us, those all too familiar yellow eyes glaring back at me. I asked my dad if he saw that. He looked up at the road and said, "Yeah, that's a fine buck. Maybe we'll come back tomorrow and track him." He hadn't seen the creature. We walked back to my campsite. I decided not to tell him what happened. My dad is a no BS kind of guy, and I knew he would not believe me. I asked how he had found me. He said that Buck made his way home, and when he saw that I wasn't with the dog, he went out to look for me. We packed up my camp and headed back home after that. I never saw the thing again. I still live in southern Oregon, but I'm far away from what stalks the woods of the Siskiyou National Forest. I grew up in many different towns in Central and Southern California. I attribute this to my stepfather, who was enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps from the early 2000s to the early 2010s. From ages 7 to 12, I lived on a Marine Corps training base in the Mojave Desert, not far from the Yucca Valley National Park. I was 10 years old at the time of this experience. The following story is true, and I have other true stories regarding my time in Mojave, if anyone is interested. Summers in the Mojave were as you would expect, hot. Some summer days could reach up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. My stepdad was a low rank in his career at this point, so unfortunately we were given a low-quality family home on the base. This meant that vital appliances, like the air conditioner, constantly malfunctioned. Usually when this happened, I could be found at the local public pool. or exploring the miles of sand-covered rocky hills that surrounded the base. This story happened on one such occasion. I can't remember exactly, but I'd say it was around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The AC was broken, and the repair company was not scheduled to fix our unit for another 2 days. Being inside the house did little to make the heat subside. Outside actually felt cooler with the occasional breeze flowing into my open bedroom window. I'd planned to spend my day at the local pool, but unfortunately it was being sanitized. Apparently, a group of teens thought it would be hilarious to throw dog poo into the pool. Needless to say, I was in hell. I decided to go to my friend's house. We'll call him Parker. I went to Parker's to see if he wanted to go explore. We did this together often. He said he'd like to, but he needed to finish his chores first. When he finally finished, we headed off for our usual hangout. It was a little playground about 100 yards from a barbed wire fence that surrounded the base. We called it home base. I asked him where he wanted to explore, knowing it would most likely be a place we'd already been to dozens of times before. He said, "Well, I have a secret place we can go. I found it the other day." I was excited and replied, "Heck yeah, where is it?" Parker pointed to the barbed wire fence. I asked, "Why are you pointing at the fence? There's no way we can climb that. The barbed wire would rip us apart." He chuckled, stood up, and motioned for me to follow. When we reached the fence, we walked about 20 yards to our left. In front of us stood 2 large sage bushes. They'd grown out about 3 feet from the fence line. They measured up about 4 feet high and had roughly 2 feet of room between the two. We walked to the opening and Parker pointed to a small hole at the bottom of the fence. The heavy rain from the previous week had washed away the sand from the bottom of it, making a small hole just big enough to fit your arm through. We decided we would dig under the fence so we could squeeze through and explore the running trail that was just on the other side. We'd seen many people running the trail before, so we dug. About an hour later, we had made the hole big enough to fit through. We agreed not to venture too far, because we didn't know the area, and it was getting later in the evening. With that, we squeezed through and popped out on the other side. We began our walk down the trail. Occasionally, we would stop to make sure drones weren't flying overhead, watching us, which is hilarious to look back on. A paranoid adolescent mind will make up some crazy things. Anyway, we were about 10 minutes into our walk when I spotted something next to a large rock on a hill, just off the trail to our right. The hill was about a half-mile ahead of us. The bright sun was glaring off of something. It was about a foot above the ground, just to the bottom right of the large rock. I pointed it out to Parker. He insisted that we go investigate, but I was hesitant. I wasn't comfortable going off the trail. With a few convincing words and a bit of peer pressure, I reluctantly agreed. We started our way towards the hill. I stopped for a moment when I noticed the glare had disappeared. I asked Parker, "Did you see that? It's gone." But then the glare reappeared suddenly. Parker replied, "Hurry up, we're almost there." We continued to walk when we heard an all too familiar sound, the sound of helicopter rotors. We instantly dropped to the sand. My heart was racing. I was sure the MPs had somehow found out we dug a hole under the fence and left the base. We couldn't tell immediately where the helicopter was, but Parker pointed out the small black dot far above the hill we were heading towards. Meanwhile, the glare had once again disappeared. We lay on the ground for roughly 60 seconds, when suddenly we saw something large stand up from where we last saw the glare. It was a huge man. We still had a bit of distance between us and the hill, so I could only roughly make out his height and clothing. Not his facial features, though. He stood approximately 6'4" and wore an army green jumpsuit. He stood in place for only a few moments before turning around and running down the hill in the direction of the incoming helicopter. We continued to lie down for a few more minutes, until the helicopter flew overhead of us and off into the direction of the base. We slowly stood up and debated our next move. Parker insisted we continue and see where the man had gone, but I wanted to head back home. The fact that a random man was out here with us made me anxious. Again, peer pressure took over my rational thinking, and before I knew it, we were ascending the hill. We made it to the top, and my anxiety grew at what we discovered. The first thing I noticed was a large outline of where the man had been lying down, molded into the sand. Next to the outline was a medium-sized duffel bag, and sitting on top of it was a pair of binoculars. This had been the glare I'd seen. It also explained why it would occasionally disappear and reappear. This man had been watching us. My stomach filled with anxious butterflies, and I told Parker I wanted to leave, now. He agreed, but before we could start our descent down the hill, I noticed something moving in the direction the man had run. It was the man. He was at the bottom of the hill, just staring at us. I stood there in shock. I could see him clearly now. He had long gray unkempt facial hair and had dirt all over his face. He then did something that made me almost cry with fear. He slowly raised his left index finger to his mouth, making the shh motion with his lips. That was it. I was done. I ran in the direction of the base with Parker close behind me. We made it back to home base and vowed to never go in there again. We never told anyone in fear of getting into trouble for making such a stupid decision. To this day, Parker and I talk about the situation occasionally. Who was the man? Why had he been watching us so intently? And why did he run? Was he scared of the helicopter? All these questions are fun to think about now, but I'm glad I never got the answers.